His name was Giovanni di Ser Marco. He was 31 years old, trained for 6 years in Montpellier, and on the morning of the 4th of October 1347, he buttoned his waxed linen coat for the very first time as a practicing plague doctor in Messina, Sicily. He had read the texts, he knew the theory, he had memorized Galen, studied the four humors, rehearsed what to say to the dying. None of it prepared him for the smell. Before he even reached the harbor district, the wind shifted and it hit him. Not decay, something worse, something alive and rotting at the same time. Something that seemed to climb into his throat and stay there. He stopped walking. He looked down at the long beak of his mask stuffed with dried lavender, camphor, and cloves, and realized, with slow, creeping certainty, this might not be enough. It was not enough. Welcome to the first day of a plague doctor. And trust me, it only gets worse from here. You have to understand something before we go any further. The image you have in your head of the plague doctor, the long black robe, the wide-brimmed hat, the haunting bird mask with the curved beak, that image is both correct and deeply misleading. Because here's the myth they never teach in school. That outfit was not medieval. It was not standard issue in 1347. The iconic beak mask was popularized by Charles Delorme, a French physician, around 1619, nearly 270 years after the Black Death first tore through Sicily. In 1347, plague doctors were improvising. Giovanni had a waxed coat, a cloth mask soaked in vinegar, and a wooden rod to avoid touching patients directly. That was it. That was the full toolkit. He was not a demon in a beak mask walking through Gothic streets. He was a scared young man in a leather apron and a wet rag over his face. Let that sit for a second. The Messina City Council had hired him 2 weeks earlier under a contract that is actually preserved in fragments. Physicians were paid per diem, not per patient saved. Giovanni earned approximately 4 silver solidi per day, which was a decent wage for the time, roughly equivalent to what a master carpenter earned in a week. The city wanted him on the streets daily. The contract specified he was required to visit the sick, record deaths, and advise on quarantine. What the contract did not specify was what to do when half the street was already dead. The morning he arrived at the harbor district, 3 Genoese trading ships had already been turned away from the port of Catania and redirected to Messina. Those ships were carrying goods from the Crimea: silk, spices, salt, and something no one had asked for. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium we now know causes bubonic plague, traveling in the fleas, living on black rats nesting in the cargo holds. Giovanni did not know about bacteria. Nobody did. Germ theory was still 5 centuries away. What he did know, standing at the entrance to the harbor warehouses, was that the men unloading those ships 9 days ago were now mostly dead, and the ones still alive were making sounds he had never heard human beings make before, a low, guttural moaning that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the chest, interrupted only by coughing that left dark stains on the ground. He gripped his wooden rod. He stepped inside. Think about that for a moment, walking into a building full of dying people with nothing but a vinegar-soaked rag between you and the most lethal pandemic in human history. Would you have gone in? But here is what no one tells you about Giovanni and men like him. They went in anyway, every single day. Not because they had a cure, they absolutely did not, but because someone had to write down who was dying, in what order, and where. Medical record-keeping in the middle of a catastrophic outbreak was itself a form of courage. The smell inside that warehouse was sulfur, copper, and something sweet. The sweetness was the worst part. He would later describe it in a note to his mentor in Montpellier as a perfume that God should never have permitted to exist. He had been on the job for 40 minutes, and then he saw the first swelling and realized the textbooks had lied about what it actually looked like. You've heard the word bubo before, probably in a history class, probably described in the same flat, clinical tone as a vocabulary term on a test. Swollen lymph nodes, bubonic plague. Moving on, Giovanni had also read about buboes. He knew they formed in the groin, the armpits, or the neck. He knew they indicated infection. He had a theoretical framework. What the texts did not convey, what they genuinely could not convey, was the size. The first patient he examined that morning was a dock worker named Aldo, approximately 40 years old, who had been placed on a straw mat against the warehouse wall by people who had since fled. Aldo was still conscious, barely. His skin was the color of a bruise. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle, and on the left side of his neck, below his jaw, there was a swelling the size of a large apple tot, shining, and so dark it was almost black at the center. Giovanni had never seen anything like it in his life. He had trained to lance abscesses, to bleed patients, to apply poultices. He reached for his lancet. He had been taught that draining infected swellings released the corrupt humors causing the illness. Standard practice. Recommended by every authority he had ever studied. He lanced it. What came out was not pus. It was a mixture of blackened blood and something else, something he could not name then, and that we now understand was necrotic tissue and fluid saturated with Yersinia pestis bacteria. The smell was catastrophic. He stepped back. He pressed his vinegar cloth to his face so hard his knuckles went white. Aldo died 20 minutes later. The lancing had done nothing except cause him additional pain in his final moments. Giovanni would not know this. He would record it as, the corruption was too advanced, and move on to the next patient. This is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Medieval medicine was not random quackery, entirely bloodletting, herbal compounds, and rest actually helped with many conditions. But the Black Death was not a condition medieval medicine had any framework to address. The physicians who walked into those rooms were operating with the intellectual equivalent of a paper map in an unknown galaxy. They were applying real training to a problem that their entire knowledge system was fundamentally unequipped to solve. And the patients trusted them anyway. Because what else do you do? By mid-morning, Giovanni had examined 11 people. 7 were showing the swellings. 4 were already septicemic, meaning the bacteria had entered their bloodstream directly, presenting with what the chronicles of the time describe as black spots upon the skin, like the marks of a terrible flowering. We call these petechiae, small hemorrhages under the skin caused by the body's clotting system breaking down. What do you think went through his mind at that point, realizing his entire education had not prepared him for this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to know. 3 of those 4 septicemic patients were dead before he finished his morning rounds. He ate lunch alone, outside, upwind from everything, sitting on a stone wall and staring at the harbor. The ships that had brought this thing were still visible in the distance, rocking gently on the water like they had done nothing wrong. They had done everything wrong. But the worst part of Giovanni's day was not the dying patients, it was the healthy ones and what they were doing to each other. Here is something the romantic history of the Black Death tends to gloss over. The social collapse happened almost immediately. Not after weeks. Not after the death toll climbed into the thousands. Within days of the first outbreak in Messina, the living were already abandoning the sick, including their own families. Giovanni witnessed this on his first afternoon. He was walking toward a residential block near the harbor. A narrow street of 2-story stone houses where the families of dock workers lived, when he heard screaming from an upper window. Not the moaning of the sick, screaming. Argument. Then a door opened, and a woman was pushed into the street. She landed hard on the cobblestones, rolled, got to her knees. She had a bubo visible on her neck, already the size of a fist. The door slammed shut. A bolt was thrown from the inside. Her husband and 3 children were on the other side of that door. They did not come back out. Giovanni walked toward her. His instinct was medical examine the swelling, offer what comfort he could. But he also understood, standing there, that there was nothing he could give her that would change what was about to happen. He recorded her first name in his notes, Maria. He noted the stage of her illness and the date, and then he kept walking, because there were 17 more addresses on his list and the afternoon light was already thinning. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it is historically accurate. In the chronicles of the 1347 outbreak, including the accounts of Michel da Piazza, a Franciscan friar who witnessed the Messina outbreak firsthand, abandonment of the sick by their families was not an exception. It was routine. Priests refused last rites. Doctors refused house calls. Neighbors sealed their windows and covered the cracks with cloth soaked in vinegar. Fear does not make people noble. Sometimes it makes them bolt their doors. And here is where it gets philosophically complicated, which is the part historians love to skim past. Those people were not simply cowards. They were making rational calculations in a situation where irrationality could kill you. If you stayed with your sick wife, you died. If you fled, there was a chance, slim, uncertain, based on no real understanding of transmission, but a chance. The mathematics of survival, in a pre-germ theory world, meant that abandon the sick was, in a terrifying way, logical. The church condemned it, the physicians condemned it, and then most of those condemning priests and physicians also caught the plague and died. which tells you something about the limits of moral authority when the disease is airborne and the fleas are everywhere. By the third hour of the afternoon, Giovanni had counted 22 confirmed dead in his assigned district that day alone. In a neighborhood of approximately 300 people, this was not a number that could be managed by conventional burial. The city's gravediggers, those who had not already fled Messina entirely, were overwhelmed. Bodies were being stacked in doorways and covered with cloth. The cloth was not enough to contain the smell. Nothing was. Giovanni walked back toward the harbor as the sun dropped low, passing a group of flagellants who had arrived from somewhere inland, men beating their own backs with leather straps, drawing blood, singing Latin hymns in ragged unison. They believed the plague was divine punishment. They believed self-inflicted suffering might appease God. He watched them for a moment. He wrote nothing in his notes about them. He just kept walking. That silence says more than any commentary could. By evening, Giovanni had one final patient to visit a nobleman who had paid handsomely for a private consultation, and what he found in that house would haunt him for the rest of his life. His name was Lord Cesare Aureliano. He was 54 years old, wealthy, well-connected to the city council, and absolutely convinced that his money could protect him. He had hired Giovanni specifically because he did not want a general practitioner. He wanted someone trained in Montpellier, someone who had studied the latest Arabic medical texts translated into Latin, someone who would tell him something useful. His household staff had been reduced to 2 servants. The rest had fled 3 days earlier when his eldest son had developed symptoms. His son was in a room on the upper floor, locked from the outside at his father's instruction. Lord Cesare met Giovanni in the entrance hall, wearing 3 layers of linen soaked in vinegar and a leather mask over his mouth. He had been advised by someone he did not say, who that vinegar fumes repelled corrupted air. He was burning aromatic herbs in every room. The house smelled like a very unfortunate pharmacy. He led Giovanni upstairs. The son, Matteo, was 22 years old. He had been ill for 4 days. He was conscious but barely responsive, burning with fever. The buboes under his arms were at the stage Giovanni had come to recognize as late middle, still firm, but beginning to show the darkening at the skin's surface that meant the underlying tissue was dying. His breathing was labored, but not yet the terminal wet rattle. There was still time, theoretically, not much, but some. Giovanni examined him carefully, thoroughly, the way his training demanded. He took the pulse rapid, weak. He examined the eyes, yellowing. He pressed gently around the swellings, noting their size, their temperature, their hardness. He asked Matteo to speak. The young man managed 3 words before collapsing back into the pillow. And then, Lord Cesare asked the question. Every physician in Europe was being asked in the autumn of 1347, and the answer was the same everywhere. What is the cure? Giovanni stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at this powerful man wrapped in 3 layers of vinegar-soaked linen, burning lavender and thyme in a bronze dish, willing his wealth and his connections and his sheer expectation to matter, and he told him the truth. I do not know. There is something quietly devastating about that moment that transcends the medieval world entirely. A trained physician at the bedside of a dying young man, in front of a father who has every resource available to him, and the honest answer is, I do not know. I have no treatment that works. I have no explanation that is correct. I have only observation and record-keeping and the small mercy of not leaving you alone. Lord Cesare dismissed him that night, paid him his 4 solidi, told him to return tomorrow. Giovanni walked home in the dark, alone, through streets that had been lively merchant districts 3 weeks earlier and were now silent, except for the occasional sound of someone coughing behind a shuttered window. He passed a cart loaded with bodies. The driver had a cloth over his face and moved at a deliberate pace, the oxen slow and indifferent. He passed the spot on the harbor wall where he had eaten lunch. The ships were gone, now expelled from the port by the desperate city council. In the belief that distance from the ships would stop the spread, the plague did not notice. It had already been in the city for 9 days. It was everywhere. Does this remind you of anything more recent? The moment authorities realized a pathogen was already inside the walls, already spreading, while they were still looking outward for the source? History has a way of rhyming. Let me know in the comments if you see the parallel. Matteo Aureliano died the following evening. His father died 4 days after that. The vinegar had not helped. Giovanni survived the first wave of the Messina outbreak. But what he wrote in his surviving notes afterward reveals something about the Black Death that modern historians only confirmed with DNA analysis in 2011, and it changes how you think about everything that came before. Here is where the story stops being just history and starts being something you should carry with you. Giovanni di Ser Marco survived the 1347 Messina outbreak. He survived the second wave in 1348. He died sometime around 1360, possibly of the plague's third return, possibly of something unrelated. The records thin out, the way records always do for people who weren't powerful enough to be remembered cleanly. But fragments of his written observations survived in the archives of a Benedictine monastery outside Palermo, and they are remarkable, not because they are medically correct, they are not, but because of what he noticed. He noticed that the disease seemed to travel with certain ships and certain people, not through corrupted air alone. He noticed that households that isolated their sick, even imperfectly, even using only cloth barriers and separate eating vessels, seemed to lose fewer members. He noticed that the plague hit hardest in densely packed neighborhoods near the harbor, and less severely in elevated districts, where the houses were spaced further apart and the air moved more freely. He was, without knowing it, observing the behavior of a flea-borne bacterium spreading through rat populations concentrated in harbor warehouses. He had no concept of fleas as disease vectors. He had no concept of bacteria, but his observations were empirically sound. He was watching the actual mechanism of transmission without the theoretical framework to understand what he was watching. This is both inspiring and heartbreaking in roughly equal measure. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. In some regions, particularly in parts of Italy and France, the death toll reached 70 to 80% in urban centers. The total death count is estimated between 75 and 200 million people globally. A range that enormous is itself a lesson in how catastrophically records broke down. In 2011, an international team of researchers extracted ancient DNA from skeletal remains in a mass burial site in London, the East Smithfield Cemetery, used specifically for Black Death victims in 1348 and 1349. They confirmed conclusively that the cause was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes plague today, and they were able to reconstruct its genome. The genetic analysis supported what Giovanni and dozens of other plague physicians had suspected from clinical observation alone. The disease spread through contact and proximity, not through the corrupted air, or divine punishment, or planetary conjunction that official explanations offered. The physicians on the ground were closer to the truth than the theologians. That does not make it less tragic that they had no way to act on the truth they were approaching. What the Black Death ultimately did to European society, beyond the staggering human loss, was fracture every institution people had trusted to protect them. The church had no answers. The physicians had no cure. The nobility could not buy safety. The social contract that told people where to go when things went wrong simply dissolved, and in the space left behind, something changed. Peasants who survived found themselves in a labor market transformed by depopulation, suddenly scarce, suddenly with leverage they had never had before. Wages rose. Serfdom in Western Europe began its long decline. The catastrophe that killed 1 in 3 people also, eventually, cracked open a feudal system that had seemed eternal. Giovanni did not live to see those changes fully realized. He saw the bodies in the streets, the abandoned children, the locked doors, the carts in the dark, but he kept showing up. Every morning, with his wooden rod and his vinegar cloth and his notebook, because someone had to. I want to ask you something before we close out, and I genuinely mean this. Does anything about Giovanni's story resonate with experiences in your own lifetime? The uncertainty, the failed institutions, the individuals who kept showing up anyway? I'd really love to read your thoughts in the comments. Take 30 seconds, tell me what you're thinking. There's one detail from Giovanni's notes that I haven't mentioned yet. One small observation he made on the evening of his very first day. Something he saw that, centuries later, would turn out to be one of the most accurate accidental observations in medieval medicine. And it brings us all the way back to where we started. That morning on the harbor road, when the wind shifted and the smell hit Giovanni for the first time, he stopped. He looked down at the beak of his cloth mask, and he noticed something that he recorded in a single sentence, almost as an aside. The rats were dying before the people. He did not know what it meant. He noted it the way a careful observer notes anything anomalous with curiosity and without explanation. But he was right. The rats die first because they are the primary hosts. When Yersinia pestis kills the rat population in a given area, the fleas abandon the bodies and seek new hosts. Human beings. The rat die-off is the warning sign. The human outbreak follows it, almost inevitably, by days. Giovanni had no theory for what he saw. He just wrote it down. 678 years later, we built an entire field of epidemiology on exactly that kind of careful, unglamorous, sometimes terrifying observation. Watch, record, keep showing up. Some things, it turns out, never really change. If this video meant something to you, if it made you think, made you uncomfortable, or made you appreciate something about the people who walked into those rooms, please leave a comment below. Your feedback genuinely shapes what we make next here at Dark Hours History. And if you want more stories like Giovanni's, you know what to do.